Hi everyone, welcome back to our Histo PH family, where forgotten Filipino history finally comes alive. Today, we're diving deep into Princess Urduja. She led 10,000 warriors, and history forgot her. A story that rewrites everything we thought we knew about our beginnings. In the year 1350, while Europe was still recovering from the Black Death, and women were considered property in most parts of the world, a Filipino princess named Urduja ruled over the kingdom of Tawalisi in what is now Pangasinan. She didn't just rule, she commanded an army of 10,000 warriors, and the most remarkable part? Most of them were women. Her story comes to us from one of history's greatest travelers, Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan explorer who journeyed across 3 continents and documented everything he saw. In his writings, he described meeting Princess Urduja and being absolutely amazed by what he witnessed. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was documented history from one of the most credible sources of the medieval period. Princess Urduja was not interested in marriage for political alliance or producing heirs like European princesses of her time. Historical accounts tell us she had one condition for any man who wanted to marry her. He had to defeat her in single combat. Not defeat her army, not defeat her champions. Defeat her. Can you imagine the strength, the skill, the absolute confidence that requires? This wasn't symbolic. She was a trained warrior who could back up her challenge. But let's talk about what made her kingdom truly extraordinary. The female warriors under her command were called the Kinalakihan, which literally translates to the men-like ones, or the manly ones. These weren't women who occasionally picked up weapons in emergencies. They were professional soldiers, trained from childhood in the art of war. They fought alongside male warriors as equals, wore the same armor, wielded the same weapons, and earned the same respect. If you're amazed by our ancestors' story, Princess Urduja, she led 10,000 warriors, and history forgot her. Help us hit our 500-like goal. Drop a comment about your favorite fact and subscribe to join the Histo PH family. Ibn Battuta wrote that these women were fierce in battle and showed no fear. They participated in raids, defended their territories, and were considered just as formidable as any male warrior. This was happening in 1350, remember. In Europe at the same time, women couldn't own property, couldn't choose their husbands, and were legally considered the property of their fathers or husbands. Joan of Arc wouldn't lead French troops for another 80 years, and when she did, she was eventually burned at the stake for it. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting. Princess Urduja wasn't an anomaly in pre-colonial Philippines. She was part of a much larger pattern of female power and equality that existed throughout the archipelago before European colonization. The Philippines had a long tradition of powerful women leaders called babaylan. These were spiritual leaders, healers, and advisors who held tremendous influence in their communities. They were predominantly women, though men could also become babaylan if they adopted feminine characteristics and dress. The babaylan weren't just religious figures. They were political advisors, military strategists, historians, and healers. They could bless warriors before battle, negotiate peace treaties, settle disputes, and even choose or depose chiefs. In many communities, the babaylan held more practical power than the male datu or raja. Spanish colonial records from the 16th and 17th centuries confirm this repeatedly, often with frustration, because the colonizers couldn't understand why these pagan priestesses had so much authority. Pre-colonial Filipino women had rights that would shock most people today. They could own and inherit property equally with men. They could engage in trade and commerce independently. They could initiate divorce freely, and when they did, they kept their property and children had rights to inheritance from both parents. Spanish friar Juan de Plasencia, who arrived in the Philippines in 1578, documented these practices extensively. He wrote about how Filipino women had too much freedom and how this needed to be corrected through Spanish law and Catholic teaching. Women in pre-colonial Philippines could become warriors, traders, priestesses, or chiefs based on their abilities, not their gender. There are multiple documented cases of female datus ruling over barangays and even larger territories. They led raids, commanded ships, negotiated treaties, and made war. This wasn't rare or exceptional. It was normal. The warrior culture of the Philippines was deeply tied to the practice of tattooing. Filipino warriors, both men and women, earned their tattoos through deeds in battle. Each tattoo represented a specific achievement: an enemy defeated, a raid survived, an honor earned. Warriors with full-body tattoos were considered elite. The Spanish called these warriors pintados, meaning the painted ones, because they were so heavily tattooed they appeared to be wearing decorated armor even when naked. Women warriors bore these same tattoos. They earned them the same way men did, through combat. Spanish records describe encountering female warriors covered in elaborate tattoos, carrying weapons and fighting with the same ferocity as men. The campilan, the fearsome Filipino sword that could cut a man in half with a single stroke, was wielded by women warriors just as effectively as by men. When the Spanish arrived in 1565 under Miguel López de Legazpi, they were genuinely shocked by what they found. They had come expecting to find primitive tribes easy to conquer and convert. Instead, they found sophisticated kingdoms with international trade networks, written languages, advanced metalworking, complex legal systems, and yes, women who fought them as equals on the battlefield. The Spanish response was systematic cultural destruction. They didn't just conquer the Philippines militarily, they set out to erase Filipino culture and replace it entirely with Spanish Catholic culture. They burned libraries full of documents written in Baybayin script. They outlawed indigenous religious practices and executed Babaylan as witches. They imposed Spanish law that stripped Filipino women of their property rights, their right to divorce, and their legal equality. Spanish friars deliberately targeted the position of women in Filipino society. Multiple colonial records show priests complaining about how Filipino women were too independent, too bold, insufficiently modest, and needed to learn submission. The Spanish introduced laws that made women legal minors under the authority of their fathers or husbands. They made divorce illegal. They removed women from positions of political and spiritual authority. They taught that women's proper role was silent obedience and childbearing. If you're still here, you're one of the rare few who truly care about the real origins of ancient Philippines history, Princess Urduja. Not just the visuals, but the truth behind them. Within a generation, the stories of women warriors and female chiefs were being dismissed as legends and exaggerations. Within 2 generations, many Filipinos themselves had forgotten that women once fought in armies and ruled kingdoms. the cultural memory was systematically erased through education, religion, and law. Princess Urduja's story survived only because Ibn Battuta had written it down in Arabic, far from Spanish censors. Even then, for centuries, historians debated whether she really existed. Some claimed she was a legend, a fantasy, or a misunderstanding. They couldn't accept that a 14th-century Asian woman could have commanded an army and refused marriage on her own terms. Modern historical research has vindicated the core of her story. While we may never know every detail of her life, we know that female military leaders existed in pre-colonial Philippines. We know that women warriors were common. We know that women held political power. We know all this because it's documented repeatedly in Spanish colonial records, even as those same Spaniards tried to eliminate these practices. The Boxer Codex, a Spanish manuscript from the 1590s, contains illustrations and descriptions of Filipino warriors, including women warriors. It shows women wearing battle armor and bearing weapons. Archaeological evidence supports this too. Burial sites have been found containing female remains buried with weapons and warrior grave goods, indicating they held warrior status in life. The irony is powerful. The same Spanish colonizers who tried to erase this history ended up preserving evidence of it in their own records. They documented what they were destroying, giving us a window into what was lost. Today, Princess Urduja's legacy is experiencing a revival. Modern Filipinos are reclaiming this history. In Pangasinan, she's celebrated as a local hero. There's a municipality named after her. There are statues, murals, and cultural celebrations. Young Filipinas are learning that their ancestors weren't passive victims waiting to be civilized. They were warriors, leaders, and free women who lived in societies that valued them as equals. The broader story of pre-colonial Filipino women's rights is also being recovered and celebrated. Historians and activists are documenting the systematic dismantling of indigenous gender equality by Spanish colonialism. This isn't about idealizing the past or claiming everything was perfect. Pre-colonial Philippines had its own problems, hierarchies, and injustices. But when it comes to gender relations, the historical record is clear. Filipino women lost rights and freedoms under Spanish rule that they had possessed for centuries before. This history matters today because it challenges narratives about gender roles being natural or traditional. When people claim that women's subordination is part of Filipino culture or Asian values, history says otherwise. The subordination of women in the Philippines isn't traditional, it's colonial. The real Filipino tradition was equality and female empowerment. The Philippines today actually reflects this pre-colonial legacy more than people realize. Despite 333 years of Spanish rule and 48 years of American colonization, Filipino women have consistently punched above their weight in politics, business, and society. The Philippines has had two female presidents. Corazon Aquino, who led the People Power Revolution that overthrew a dictatorship in 1986, and Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who served from 2001 to 2010. That's two female heads of state. The United States, which loves to lecture other countries about democracy and equality, has had 0. The United Kingdom has had 3 in its entire history. France has had 0. Germany has had 1. The Philippines, supposedly a developing nation that needs Western guidance, has had 2 female presidents in just the last 40 years. Filipino women today hold a higher percentage of senior business positions than women in the United States, Japan, or most European countries. They dominate certain professions like pharmacy and education. They inherit equally with brothers. While divorce still isn't legal in the Philippines due to lingering Catholic influence, legal separation exists, and women initiate it more often than men. This isn't despite Filipino culture. It's because deep in the cultural DNA, there's a memory of equality that colonialism couldn't completely erase. Princess Urduja and the countless other powerful pre-colonial Filipino women left a legacy that survives. When you share Princess Urduja's story, you're not just sharing ancient history, you're challenging the colonial narrative that still affects how Filipinos see themselves today. You're proving that strong, independent women aren't a Western export or a modern invention. You're showing that Filipino women were leading armies when European women were legal property. You're also connecting to a global movement to decolonize history. All over the world, people are discovering that their ancestors had sophisticated civilizations, advanced technologies, and progressive social systems before European colonization. The colonial narrative that Europeans brought civilization to backward peoples is being exposed as propaganda. From Africa to Asia to the Americas, indigenous histories are being recovered and celebrated. Princess Urduja is part of that global story. She proves that in 1350, while Europe was mired in feudalism and religious oppression, women in the Philippines were commanding armies and ruling kingdoms. She proves that gender equality isn't a Western concept that Asia needs to import. It's an Asian tradition that colonialism tried to destroy. Her story also raises challenging questions. What would Southeast Asia look like today if colonization hadn't happened? What would Filipino society look like if that tradition of female empowerment had continued uninterrupted? What was lost that we can never recover? What knowledge, what stories, what possibilities went up in flames when the Spanish burned Filipino libraries? We'll never know the full answer to those questions, but we can honor what survived. We can tell Princess Urduja's story. We can teach it to our children. We can make sure that this time history doesn't forget her. Our ancestors' stories don't end here. They're just waiting to be rediscovered. Smash that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to join the HistoPH family for the next epic chapter of our forgotten history.